The night Isabella Moretti Romano stood in a ballroom surrounded by flowers and champagne, 8 months pregnant and glowing under crystal chandeliers, her husband took a bullet and used his body to shield another woman. Not her, not his wife, not the mother of his unborn child. Bianca Hart, his mistress. Right there, in front of every crime family on the eastern seaboard, Vincent Romano made his choice without hesitation. If you want to know what a woman does when her world collapses in a single second, stay until the end. Hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The gala had been Isabella's idea. That was the bitter irony she would carry for years. She had planned the whole night herself. The venue, the flowers, the guest list, the seating chart. She had spent 6 weeks coordinating with the event staff at the Harrington Grand, a ballroom on the 42nd floor of one of the most expensive hotels in the city, all glass and marble and brass fixtures that caught the light and threw it back in fragments. She had chosen the centerpieces, white peonies and pale gold eucalyptus, because Vincent had once mentioned years ago and almost offhandedly that white flowers at night looked like something out of a dream. She had remembered that. She remembered everything. The Romano Family Charitable Foundation Gala was the organization's 10th anniversary. 10 years of donations to children's hospitals, literacy programs, housing initiatives for veterans. The public face of an empire built on blood money and territorial violence, scrubbed clean by tax attorneys and nonprofit accountants. Isabella knew what the family was. She had known since before the wedding. She hadn't walked into this life with her eyes closed. She had walked in with them wide open, and she had told herself that the good she could do from inside the machine was worth the moral cost. She had told herself that for 5 years. She was still telling herself that as she stood in front of the floor-length mirror in the hotel suite that evening, smoothing the front of her midnight blue gown over the hard round shelf of her belly, 8 months and 3 weeks along, and thought, this is the last event before the baby comes. One more night of being Isabella Romano, wife of the Dawn, and then everything changes. She had no idea how right she was. Vincent came in behind her while she was touching up her lipstick, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway in his black tuxedo and looked at her the way he used to. That dark, focused look that used to make her breath go short. He was a physically imposing man, Vincent Romano. 6'2", broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from stone, and eyes that were nearly black in most lighting. He had a scar below his left ear from something he'd never explained, and kids that were too rough for the manicured life he appeared to lead. He had been beautiful to her once. He still was, in the way that something dangerous can be beautiful. Like you know better than to reach for it, and you reach anyway. "You look good," he said. 2 words. Not "you look stunning" or "you're the most beautiful woman in this room." Not "how are you feeling" or "should you even be on your feet tonight." Just, "you look good." The same thing he might say to a soldier who'd shown up in clean clothes. "Thank you," Isabella said, and turned back to the mirror. She didn't say, "That's all you've got." She didn't say, "I'm carrying your son and I've been on my feet for 6 hours making sure tonight is perfect, and that's what you give me?" She had stopped saying those things. Somewhere in the last year she had learned to swallow them, to press them down into a space behind her sternum, where they sat compressed and airless, waiting. Vincent's phone buzzed. He looked at it and something in his face shifted. A micro-expression, there and gone, a slight softening around the mouth that Isabella recognized the way you recognize a language you used to speak fluently but haven't used in years. She had seen that same expression when he looked at her, back at the beginning. She knew what caused it now. He pocketed the phone without showing her the screen and said, "We should get downstairs." "I'll be 2 minutes," she said. He nodded and was already gone. Isabella held her own gaze in the mirror for a long moment. She pressed one hand flat against the side of her belly, felt the answering push of a small foot or fist from inside, that weird and private communication that had become the most honest relationship in her life these last few months. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one. "Okay." Downstairs, the gala was already in full swing by the time she descended. 240 guests, senators, city commissioners, federal judges whose names she had been told never to repeat in certain company, Legitimate businessmen who kept the Romano family insulated from direct criminal exposure. Family allies from Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta. Men who ran similar operations, who moved similar money, who attended events like this in similar tuxedos and told similar lies about where their wealth came from. Their wives stood beside them in expensive gowns, doing the same work Isabella did every night. Smile, pour oil on troubled water, remember names, soften edges. She moved through the room the way she had been trained to. Head up, shoulders back, hand resting at her side rather than clutching her belly, though she wanted to. She shook hands and accepted compliments about her glow and laughed at things that weren't quite funny and kept track of every conversation fragment that might matter later. This was her skill, the thing she had built in this life because she had needed something to be hers. She understood people, read rooms, translated subtext. She had probably prevented 3 actual conflicts in the last hour just by positioning herself at the right moment between the right parties and saying the right nothing. She saw Bianca Hart across the room at 8:20. The woman was in red. Of course she was in red. It was the kind of choice that announced itself. A deep crimson dress, backless, with a slit that caught every eye in the vicinity. Bianca was 32, 4 years younger than Isabella, and she had the kind of face that made men's conversations drift and lose their thread. She had been Vincent's personal attorney for 3 years before Isabella had understood what that actually meant. Before the hotel receipts, before the phone that buzzed with texts he'd turn away to read. Before the night 6 months ago when Isabella had sat in her car in a parking garage for 40 minutes because she had driven to a restaurant on the east side to surprise Vincent for his birthday and found him inside, sitting across from Bianca with his hand over hers on the table. He hadn't seen her. She had sat in the car and felt something she couldn't name. Not quite heartbreak, not quite rage. Something colder. Something that sat in the chest like a stone and didn't dissolve. She had gone home, put the birthday gift in the back of the closet, made herself dinner, gone to bed. Bianca was speaking to one of the Chicago men now, laughing at something, touching her own collarbone in that way she had that read as unconscious, but was anything but. Isabella watched her for exactly 3 seconds and then looked away. Vincent was at the bar with his underboss, Marco Vitale, a squat and watchful man who had been with the family since before Vincent took over. They were speaking low, and Marco's expression was the expression he wore when something was wrong. A tight horizontal line where his mouth usually was, eyes scanning the room over Vincent's shoulder. Isabella navigated toward them on instinct. She had learned to read Marco the same way sailors learn to read the sky, not for pleasure, but because the information could save her. She got within 8 feet when Vincent turned and saw her coming, and said something to Marco that made the older man give a short nod and angle away. Vincent stepped forward to meet her. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her voice pleasant. "Fine," Vincent said. "Relax. Enjoy the night." "Marco doesn't look like it's fine." "Marco's paranoid by profession. It's why I pay him." He touched her arm. A brief press of fingers, the kind of contact that was performed rather than felt. "Go talk to Judge Harding's wife. She's been standing alone for 20 minutes. A deflection, dressed as a courtesy. She recognized the shape of it. She went and talked to Judge Harding's wife. At 9:45, the Foundation's executive director gave a brief speech about the year's charitable accomplishments. Isabella sat at the head table, hands in her lap, and listened to the applause and told herself, after this. After this, things change. The baby comes, the landscape shifts, and she would figure out what she was doing and what she was not going to do anymore. She had been saying after this for months, but for the first time the after had a concrete shape to it. A due date, a name already chosen, a room painted soft gray with a dark wood crib that had cost more than her first car. She was still in that thought when the sound started outside. It wasn't a sound she had ever heard in real life, only in films. But your body knows it before your brain catches up. It's a cellular recognition. The crack of gunfire is particular, flat and sharp and wrong in a way that disconnects you from the situation for a quarter second before your nervous system slams back online and every animal instinct you have screams at you to move. 3 shots. Then 2 more. Then a sound she couldn't identify. Glass somewhere, a shout that was cut short. The room exploded. 240 people and the collective roar of them all discovering danger at once. is not a sound Isabella had any framework for. Chairs scraping, glass breaking, women screaming, men yelling into phones. The hotel staff moving toward exits, trained for emergencies, but not for this particular category of emergency. Isabella was on her feet before she was conscious of standing, one hand instinctively curved around her belly, her eyes searching the room in the automatic way she searched every room now. Exits, distance, obstacles. Vincent was gone from her side before she could locate him. She didn't remember seeing him leave the table. One of his soldiers, a young man named Caruso, who had been stationed near the main doors all evening, shoved toward her through the crowd. His jacket was open and his hand was at his hip and his face was the color of chalk. Mrs. Romano. He reached her and took her arm. "We need to move you." "Where is my husband?" she said. "Ma'am, where is Vincent?" Caruso's jaw worked. "He went outside. Please, we need to—" She pulled her arm out of his grip. She wasn't thinking. That is the most honest description she would ever be able to give of what happened next. She was not running on thought. She was running on the same instinct that had kept her functional through 5 years of a life that ran on violence and silence and the constant low-level awareness that nothing was ever as safe as it looked. She moved through the crowd the way water moves through a crack, finding the gaps, pressing through, keeping her arm across her belly to protect it from the elbows and shoulders of people pushing in the other direction. The main doors, the corridor, the sound of voices that were not panicked but directed, the controlled, aggressive voices of men who were dealing with a situation rather than fleeing one. She came through the service corridor exit onto the broad marble steps that fronted the hotel's main entrance, and she stopped. There were 4 men down on the plaza. 2 of them were clearly Vincent's. She recognized the jackets. The other 2 she didn't know, and their position suggested they had not survived whatever had happened here 60 seconds ago. There were 3 black SUVs, and one of them was at an angle it shouldn't be, and its windshield was gone, and the smell was something she had never smelled before. Chemical and copper and cold night air. And then she saw Vincent. He was on his knees on the marble, and for one ice-cold second she thought he had been shot and killed, and her entire body seized in her chest. But he was moving. He was pressing both hands against someone, against a body that was on the ground in front of him, and he was talking, low and urgent, and the someone was in red. Bianca Hart was lying on the marble steps with blood spreading from her right shoulder, soaking through the crimson dress so that the wet and dry versions of the fabric were indistinguishable from a distance. Her face was turned up toward Vincent's, and her hand was clutching his sleeve. And Vincent was bent over her with an expression on his face that Isabella had not seen on him in at least 2 years. She recognized the expression because she had been the cause of it once, a long time ago. It was fear, real fear, not tactical wariness or professional threat assessment, the naked, gut-punched fear of someone whose world has just placed something irreplaceable in danger. Around them, Vincent's soldiers were forming a perimeter, weapons out, radios going. Somewhere behind Isabella, Caruso was calling her name. The city noise, sirens, horns, the distant bass of another world entirely, kept moving beneath all of it. Isabella stood at the top of the steps. She was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant. She had been on her feet since noon. Her ankles were swollen, and her lower back had been aching since 6 p.m., and she had planned every detail of this evening to project strength and stability and the image of a family worth respecting. And her husband was on his knees in front of his mistress, looking at her the way he had not looked at Isabella since before the pregnancy. No, longer than that. Since before she had figured out what was happening. Since before the thing between them had gone brittle and cold and careful. He had taken a bullet for Bianca Hart. That was the story she put together in the 12 seconds she stood there, reading the scene with the same skill she used to read every room. Caruso had said he went outside, gone out ahead of the evacuation, driven by something. The position of the bodies, the angle of the SUV, the blood on Vincent's hands. He had put himself in front of the shot. He had seen it coming and moved toward Bianca rather than back inside toward his pregnant wife. She felt something happen in her chest, not breaking. She had expected this. She had been expecting some version of this for months. It was more like confirmation. The sensation of a door closing that had been standing open for too long, letting in cold air. Caruso reached her side. "Mrs. Romano, I am begging you to come with me." She let him take her arm this time. She did not look back at Vincent. She did not cry until she was in the elevator, the doors closed, alone for 11 floors. She pressed both hands against her belly and felt the baby move, that private, insistent push of a life that did not know yet what its parents were. She stood in the elevator and cried without making any sound at all, because she had learned in this life that you never let anyone hear you when you fall apart. You kept the breakdown small and contained, and you were done with it by the time the doors opened. By the time the elevator reached the suite floor, she was done. She washed her face. She changed out of the gown. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed, and she thought very carefully and very clearly, which was how she thought best. Not in heat, not in emotion, but in the quiet after, when the adrenaline was gone and what was left was just the truth. She thought, what do I actually know? She thought, what can I actually prove? She thought, what does a woman in my position actually do? She sat there for a long time. The baby pressed against her ribs. Somewhere below, she could hear the distant wail of ambulances arriving. She didn't move to the window. 3 hours later, Vincent came back to the suite. He had changed his shirt, which she noted because it meant he had gone somewhere to clean up before coming to her. His hands were washed. The evidence was gone. He moved carefully, which meant he was thinking about what to say, which meant he already knew there was something to say. He found her sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of water and a book she hadn't read a single word of. "Bella," he said. He only called her Bella when he needed something from her. Softness, forgiveness, space. She had cataloged this without ever mentioning it. "How is she?" Isabella said. A silence, the kind that confirmed things. "She'll live," he said. "The bullet caught her shoulder. They took her to St. Luke's. She's out of surgery." Isabella nodded. She set the water down on the windowsill with a careful click of glass on stone. "You're going to tell me that you went out because there was a threat and you had to assess it," she said. "You're going to tell me that Bianca was in the wrong place and you reacted on instinct. You're going to tell me it doesn't mean what it looks like." Vincent said nothing. Or, Isabella said, "You could not tell me anything at all, which would be the first honest thing you've done in about a year." "Isabella, I'm not fighting with you tonight." Her voice was so flat it didn't even qualify as cold. Cold implied temperature. This was something past temperature. "I am 8 months pregnant, and I stood on those steps and watched you, so we are not doing this tonight. You can sleep in the other room." "I'm not going to—" "Vincent?" She looked at him directly. "Sleep in the other room." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was sorting through options, calculating. Even now, even here, his brain was running probability and strategy. He went to the other room. Isabella sat in the chair until she heard the silence settle completely on the other side of the door. Then she got up, moved slowly to the desk, opened her phone, and made one call. It rang twice. "Hey," said the woman on the other end. Donna Coretti, Isabella's oldest friend, her connection to the version of herself that had existed before all of this. A forensic accountant who had nothing to do with organized crime and everything to do with knowing where money went when people tried to hide it. "I need you to start looking at something," Isabella said, quietly, "through the back channels we talked about." A pause. "How serious?" Isabella looked at the closed door. "I need to know everything about Bianca Hart," she said. "Every account, every communication, every relationship she has with every other family, all of it." Another pause, longer this time. "Isabella," Donna said carefully, "are you sure you want to go down this road?" Isabella placed one hand flat on the desk. Her fingers were steady. "I was sure 6 months ago," she said. "I just wasn't ready. I'm ready now." She hung up. Outside, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent, relentless, burning through the night on its own logic. Isabella stood at the window and looked down at the lights and thought about what the next weeks were going to require of her. And she thought about her son who was not born yet and what she was going to give him. And she thought about the expression on Vincent Romano's face as he knelt on those marble steps over a woman in a red dress. She thought, he doesn't know what I'm capable of. She thought, that is the last mistake he's going to make about me. She turned off the lights and went to bed and lay in the dark with her hand on her belly, and she did not sleep, and she did not cry again. And by the time the first gray light started coming through the windows, she had the beginning of a plan. The beginning was enough. The rest would follow. It always did when she decided something. And what she had decided, lying in that dark hotel room while her husband slept on the other side of a closed door he had chosen to walk through, was that everything was about to change, not loudly, not with a scene or a confrontation or the kind of dramatic collapse that people wrote about in the gossip columns. Quietly, precisely, the way she did everything that actually mattered. She was going to find out everything Bianca Hart had done, and then she was going to use it. Outside, the ambulances had long since gone. The marble steps of the Harrington Grand had been cleaned. The evidence of the shooting was already being processed, managed, suppressed by the machinery that the Romano family kept on permanent retainer for exactly these moments. By morning, the official story would be a robbery gone wrong, a tragic near miss, no serious injuries. The machine would protect itself. What the machine didn't know was that Isabella had spent 5 years learning how the machine worked, and she was about to run it herself. Basket. The morning was relentlessly ordinary. That was the thing about catastrophic personal moments. The world didn't slow down for them. The sun came up at its scheduled time, yellow-gray through the hotel curtains, and the city below started its noise, and somewhere across town, Bianca Hart was waking up in a hospital bed with Vincent Romano's name on her lips, and none of it looked any different from any other morning. Isabella ordered breakfast from room service, ate it sitting up in bed, and checked her email. Donna had already sent a preliminary list of documents to look for. Encrypted, the message deleted immediately after reading, the kind of communication protocol they had established 3 years ago when Isabella had first begun to suspect that her marriage was not what she'd been told it was. She showered, she dressed, she combed her hair with the same careful attention she gave everything, thorough, unhurried, precise. When Vincent came out of the other room at 7:30 in his shirt and suit pants, she was sitting at the desk with her laptop open, reviewing Foundation financial reports. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "We should talk," he said. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, without looking up. "Isabella." "Vincent." She glanced up then, briefly. "We can talk when I'm ready to talk. Right now I'm working. Get some breakfast." His expression moved through something. Frustration, calculation, something she might have once mistaken for guilt. He went to the phone and called down for coffee. He sat at the table by the window and drank it while she worked, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them had the particular texture of a silence that both people know cannot last, but neither is ready to break on the other's terms. This was how it was going to be, she realized. He would try to manage her the way he managed everything. With patience, with strategic concession, with the confidence of a man who had never lost anything he'd decided to keep. He would offer explanations and partial admissions and just enough accountability to create the impression of remorse without the substance of it. And then he would wait for her to accept it, because she always had before. He was going to wait a long time. Across town, in the forensic accounting firm that bore Donna Coretti's name on the door, the first of several deep background investigations was beginning. Financial threads being pulled, corporate structures being mapped, communication records, the ones that were findable if you knew the right places to look and had the right relationships with the right people, beginning their slow journey toward the surface. Isabella knew something about Bianca Hart that Vincent did not. She knew it not because she'd been told, but because she'd been paying attention for 2 years while Vincent stopped paying attention to anything except what he wanted. She had seen the patterns, the timing of certain interceptions, the way some of the Romano family's most sensitive operations had faced friction at precisely the moments when Bianca had been present for the information that would have made that friction possible. She'd dismissed it initially, then she'd filed it away, then she'd started watching more carefully. Bianca Hart was not just a mistress who had made herself necessary. She was something with a purpose, something aimed. Isabella wasn't certain yet at what or by whom, but she was going to find out. And then the woman who had watched her husband throw himself over a bullet meant for his mistress while she stood frozen and forgotten on a marble staircase. The woman who had spent 5 years being underestimated in every room she walked into was going to do something about it. She turned back to her laptop. The baby pressed against her ribs. She kept working. 3 weeks after the gala, Vincent Romano came home to find his wife rearranging the nursery. That was how he would later describe the period to Marco. Not with the specificity it deserved, not with any acknowledgement of what was actually happening beneath the surface of those ordinary domestic scenes, but with the vague and self-serving language of a man who had decided not to look too closely at the thing he'd broken. She's been quiet. She's nesting. It's the pregnancy. Marco had nodded and said nothing, which was its own form of communication between them, a language of omissions they had spoken for 20 years. What Vincent did not say, because he had not allowed himself to fully register it, was that Isabella had changed in a way that had no good explanation if you were paying attention. She was calm. Not the strained, surface-level calm she'd maintained since early in the pregnancy, the kind that had the specific tension of someone holding themselves together by will alone. This was different. This was the calm of someone who had already made the hard decision and was now simply executing it. There was no more edge to her silences, no more momentary catches in her breath when Bianca's name was mentioned. She had stopped flinching. She had stopped fighting. And Vincent Romano, who had built a criminal empire on reading threat levels in rooms and in men, took his wife's settled quietude as evidence that she had accepted the situation. He was wrong in a way that would eventually cost him everything. The nursery was painted soft gray, and when he appeared in the doorway, she was standing on a step stool. She absolutely should not have been on at this stage of the pregnancy, adjusting a framed print on the wall. He crossed the room in 3 strides and put his hands at her waist and said, "Get down from that." And she let him help her down without resistance, and that should have told him something, because the Isabella of 2 months ago would have told him she didn't need his hands on her. "Thanks," she said, flat, factual, not warm, not cold, just a word deployed to fill a space. "You shouldn't be on the stool. I'm aware." He stood there with his hands still at her waist for a beat too long, and she turned back to look at the print without moving away from him, which was somehow worse than if she'd stepped back. She simply didn't register his presence as significant enough to respond to, one way or the other. "We should talk," he said. He had been saying this for 3 weeks. "About what specifically?" she said. "About the night of the gala. About what you saw." She turned her head and looked at him, and he had the uncanny experience of being looked at by someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation and was only observing it for completeness. "You protected your mistress instead of your pregnant wife," she said. "I saw it. You know I saw it. We both know what it means. What would you like to say about it that would change any of those facts?" He opened his mouth. "Vincent," she said, before he could use it. "I'm not asking that to be cruel. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know if there is something you think you can say that would change those facts. Because if there isn't, then we don't need to have the conversation. We need to have a different conversation." He closed his mouth. She turned back to the print on the wall, centered it slightly, stepped back to check the level. "What different conversation?" he said. "Not today," she said. "I'm tired, and my back hurts, and I'd like to finish the room." He stood in the doorway of the nursery for another few seconds, feeling, for the first time in as long as he could remember, completely without leverage. Then he went downstairs. In the kitchen, he poured 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the counter and drank it faster than he should have, and thought about the expression on Isabella's face, or more precisely, the absence of expression, the perfect neutral surface that had replaced whatever used to be there. He thought, "She's fine. She's processing. She'll come around." He finished the scotch. He thought, "She'll come around." Across town, in a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of a building that housed 3 different legal firms and 2 investment groups that were not what they claimed to be, Donna Coretti was spreading documents across a table with the careful, unhurried movements of someone performing surgery. Isabella sat across from her, both hands flat on the table, and listened. "Okay," Donna said. "Here's what I have so far, and I want you to understand that this is only what I can see from the outside. The full picture is probably worse." "Show me." Donna turned a page. Bianca Hart has been licensed as an attorney in the state for 9 years. Her practice is nominally criminal defense, But the majority of her actual billable work, the stuff that shows up in fee disclosures, has been with Romano family entities for the last 4. Now, that's not unusual for an attorney with a long-term organizational client. What's unusual is this. She slid a document across. 7 months ago, she opened a shell company in Delaware. Standard structure, nothing to notice on its face. Except this company received 3 wire transfers from a numbered account that traces, and this took Renata 3 days to work backward, to a holding entity connected to the Marchetti family out of Philadelphia. Isabella looked at the document. She did not react visibly. The Marchettis, she said. Who, as you know, have been in territorial dispute with the Romanos over the Jersey corridor for the better part of 18 months. I know what the Marchettis are. Then you know that money from the Marchettis going to a shell company controlled by your husband's personal attorney is a problem, Isabella said. A significant problem. Yes. Isabella picked up the document and read through the account numbers, the dates, the amounts. Her face was the same face she'd had in the nursery that morning, steady, absorbing. Is there more? She said. There's more, Donna confirmed. The Crestfield packing operation, the one that went sideways in October, lost the Romano family about $2.3 million in seized assets. The federal tip that kicked off that investigation was called in from a burner phone. I can't trace the phone directly, but I can trace the timing, and the timing corresponds to a week when Bianca Hart had access to the operational schedule because Vincent had brought her into a meeting where it was discussed. Silence. He brought her into an operational meeting, Isabella said. He did. Isabella set the document down. How much of this is solid enough to take somewhere? She said. As it stands, none of it. It's circumstantial. Account connections that could be explained other ways, timing that a good defense attorney, and Bianca would use a very good defense attorney, could pull apart in front of a jury. What I'd need to make it actionable is either a direct communication showing intent or a witness with first-hand knowledge. Isabella nodded slowly. Keep looking. Isabella. Donna leaned forward slightly. I have to ask you something directly. When you figure out what she's doing, and based on what I'm seeing, she has been running both sides of this for a while, playing the Romano organization against the Marchettis and taking money from both. What are you going to do with it? Isabella looked at her. The right thing, she said. Donna studied her for a moment. That answer could mean a lot of different things coming from a Romano. I know, Isabella said. She pushed back from the table and stood, moving carefully with the weight of the pregnancy. That's intentional. She picked up her coat and left. The soldiers started choosing sides in the way that soldiers always do when they can feel a power structure shifting, quietly, through small decisions, through who they made eye contact with, and who they deferred to in logistical questions, and whose calls they answered fastest. It was invisible to most people inside the Romano organization. It was not invisible to Marco Vitale. Marco had been the Romano family's underboss since Vincent's father ran the operation, which meant he had seen 2 full generational transfers of power and understood better than anyone what the preliminary signals looked like. He had seen young Vincent consolidate his grip in the months after his father's stroke, the careful redistribution of loyalty, the small favors that built into debts, the conversations that sounded like nothing but meant everything. He recognized the pattern because he'd helped execute it once. He was watching Isabella run it now. She wasn't doing it, obviously. She never did anything, obviously. She was doing it through the charity foundation, through the legitimate business side of the Romano operation that she had always managed. Board meetings, community relationships, the network of people who were connected to the family through money and need rather than violence. Those people, it turned out, were the connective tissue that held the whole organization together in ways that the men with guns had never fully appreciated. When the prosecutor's office wanted a quiet conversation before filing something, they called the foundation. When the city commissioner needed a favor redirected, it went through foundation channels. When Romano family allies wanted to meet in a context that didn't require anyone to acknowledge what the meeting was really about, the foundation's annual events were the venue. Isabella controlled all of that. And in the last 3 weeks, Marco had noticed the captains who relied on those channels, Ricci, Di Matteo, Ostroff, had started calling Isabella directly rather than going through Vincent's office first, not for criminal matters, for the infrastructure that made the criminal matters sustainable. He brought it to Vincent on a Tuesday in the back office of the dry cleaning operation on Faraday Street that served as one of their legitimate fronts. "I'm telling you this because you need to know it," Marco said. He sat in the chair across from Vincent's desk with his hands on his knees and his voice at the same volume he always used, which was one notch below what the room required. "Not because I'm taking a side." "What side?" Vincent said. "There are starting to be sides." Vincent put down the pen he'd been holding. "What does that mean?" "It means that Ricci called your wife last week about the East Side zoning issue before he called you. It means DiMatteo ran the Harrington family request through foundation channels, and Isabella resolved it in 48 hours. It means the men who interact with the legitimate face of this operation are beginning to understand who runs that face. She's always managed the foundation." Vincent. Marco said his name the way he'd been saying it for 30 years. Not with deference, but with the particular patience of a man who cared enough about someone to tell them what they didn't want to hear. "She has always managed the foundation. She has recently begun managing the relationships that the foundation exists to maintain. Those are different things." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "She's pregnant," he said. This is what she does when she's stressed. She works." Marco looked at him for a long time without speaking. "What?" Vincent said. "Nothing," Marco said. "Say it." "I'm saying it by not saying it," Marco told him. "I've been around long enough to know when a room is changing shape. The shape of this room is changing." He stood up, straightened his jacket. "You've been spending 3 afternoons a week at St. Luke's," Marco said. Not an accusation, just a fact, delivered in the flat voice of someone who tracked everything. "Bianca almost died," Vincent said. "I know what Bianca almost did," Marco said. "That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you're not doing while you're doing that." He left without elaborating. He had made his point. Whether Vincent absorbed it was Vincent's problem. He had his own calculations to run. The confrontation with Vincent happened on a Thursday evening, 14 days before Isabella's due date, and it happened because Vincent made the mistake of bringing Bianca Hart's name into his own home. Isabella was in the kitchen when he came in, later than he'd said, carrying the particular energy of someone who'd been somewhere that required him to compose himself before walking through the door. She had learned to read that particular composition. The slight over-relaxation of the shoulders, the careful neutrality of the face. It was the face he put on when he was managing his own guilt. She was cutting vegetables for something she wasn't going to eat. She'd found that having a task to perform made difficult conversations easier because it gave her hands something to do and gave her eyes somewhere to go. "Bianca's going to need ongoing physical therapy," he said. He said it the way you might announce a change in weather, as though it was simply information. "The damage to the shoulder is more extensive than they initially—" "Vincent," she said. She set the knife down on the board with a careful click. "I want you to think, before you continue this sentence, about whether you actually intend to stand in this kitchen 14 days before I give birth to your son and discuss the medical requirements of the woman you've been sleeping with." He stopped. "Because I will have that conversation if you want to," she said, "but I want you to choose it deliberately. I want you to choose it out loud." The kitchen was very quiet. "It's not," he started. "It is," she said. "It is exactly what it is. The question is whether you're going to tell me that out loud or whether you're going to keep doing what you've been doing, which is treating me like someone you've decided doesn't need to be told the truth about her own life." He crossed the kitchen toward her, and she didn't step back, just watched him come, and he stopped on the other side of the island from her and put both hands on the counter and leaned forward, and she had seen this posture 1,000 times. The physical declaration of a man who wanted to believe that proximity was intimacy. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I know you don't. You never want to fight. You want to have feelings and then have everything continue the way it was. That's not a fight, Vincent. That's a monologue. I'm not a monologue." Something moved in his face. She saw it. The flash of something that might have been real, under the management, under the strategy. She noted it and filed it and did not let it change her position. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Right now?" Nothing. She picked the knife back up and resumed what she'd been doing. That's the actual answer. Right now, I want nothing from you. I want you to go somewhere else in this house and let me finish cooking and not bring Bianca Hart's physical therapy into my kitchen. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he went somewhere else. Isabella stood at the cutting board for a while after he left and breathed the way you breathe when you're keeping something down. Slow, deliberate, through the nose. The baby pressed at her ribs from the inside. She felt it and pressed back gently with her free hand. Almost, she said very quietly. Almost. Donna called at 8:45 that night, after Vincent had gone to the study and Isabella had eaten alone and cleared the kitchen and was sitting in the bedroom with her feet up and the account documents spread across the comforter around her. I found the communication, Donna said. Isabella said nothing. She waited. Text messages? Routed through an encrypted app that she probably thought was untraceable. She was wrong about the metadata. Renata was able to pull the recipient identifiers. Isabella, she has been in direct contact with Silvio Marchetti. Silvio Marchetti, the underboss of the Philadelphia family, the second most dangerous man in the Marchetti organization and the primary architect of every territorial move they'd made against the Romanos in the last 2 years. What kind of contact? Isabella said. Planning contact, Donna said. I can't read the content of the messages. The encryption is still holding on that end, but the frequency and the timing... Donna paused, and in that pause, Isabella heard the sound of someone choosing their words with care. There is a summit scheduled. I know you know about this. The Multifamily Peace Summit next month. I know about it. Bianca has been in communication with Silvio Marchetti with increasing frequency in the 10 days since that summit was confirmed. The room was quiet. Isabella looked down at the documents on the comforter. She thought about Bianca Hart in a red dress on a marble staircase. She thought about Vincent's hands pressed against Bianca's shoulder and the expression on his face. She thought about a shell company in Delaware and wire transfers from Philadelphia and a federal tip that had cost the Romano family $2.3 million. She thought about a woman who had spent 4 years making herself indispensable to the most powerful man in this organization, learning every piece of sensitive information he'd let her access, building relationships with every opposing family, playing both sides of every move. Not an affair. A project. How close is she to whoever she's working for? Isabella said. I think, Donna said carefully, that she might be whoever she's working for. I think she might be the one directing the play. Isabella closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she opened them. I need 2 things, she said. I need everything you just told me documented and packaged in a way that can be presented formally. And I need a contact at the federal level. Someone who has been watching the Marchetti expansion and would consider this actionable. Isabella, if you take this federal... I know what it means, Isabella said. Document it. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the bedroom for a long time. She could hear, distantly, the sound of the television from Vincent's study. Some late news program, the measured cadence of voices discussing a world that bore no relation to this one. She thought, I should tell him. She thought, if I tell him now, he buries it. He protects her. He decides what to do with it and cuts me out of the decision the way he's cut me out of everything that actually matters. He has spent 4 years deciding that I am a function of this organization, not a part of it. The wife, the face, the woman who plans the galas. She thought, he chose her on those steps. He chose her in front of everyone. He can live for a little while with what that choice is going to cost him. She gathered the documents together, stacked them neatly, and put them in the fireproof case at the back of her closet that Vincent didn't know she had. 2 floors below, in the parking structure beneath the Romano townhouse, a black sedan that didn't belong to anyone on the household staff had been parked since 6 p.m. Inside it, a man was making a call. The call was short. When it ended, the man sat for a moment in the dark, then looked up at the building, at the lit window on the 3rd floor that was Isabella's bedroom, and thought about what his employer would say when he reported back on what he'd heard tonight. His employer was not Vincent Romano. His employer was not the Marchetti family. His employer was the woman on the 3rd floor. He had been on her payroll for 11 days, since the day she had sat across a table from a man named Reyes, who handled security contracts for 3 different organizations, and said, very quietly, that she needed someone positioned in the household who reported only to her, not to Vincent, not to Marco, not to anyone in the Romano chain of command, only to her. Reyes had said, "That's a complicated ask, Mrs. Romano." And she had said, "I know. I'm a complicated woman. Are you interested or not?" The man in the sedan, whose name was Tate and who had worked various sides of various operations for 15 years without strong allegiance to any of them, ended his call and settled back in the seat and thought about the fact that in his considerable professional experience, the most dangerous people were not the ones who got loud when they were betrayed. They were the ones who got very, very quiet. And then they got organized. He had heard the name Bianca Hart twice in the last week, in context that suggested she was preparing something significant around the summit date. He had heard Isabella Romano, through the thin architecture of a monitored room, put the word federal on the table without flinching. He thought, whoever is running against this woman is not going to see her coming. He started the car and drove out of the parking structure. Into the Tate's report came in at 6:12 in the morning, 11 days before the summit. Isabella was already awake. She had been awake since 4, which had become her default in the final stretch of the pregnancy, her body refusing the full depth of sleep, keeping her in a shallow, restless layer where every small sound in the house registered, and her mind ran its calculations in the dark without her permission. She had stopped fighting it. She used the hours. She lay on her side with the phone on the pillow in front of her face and read through financial documents and communication logs with the lamp on its lowest setting and the door closed and the sound machine running in the corner to cover the light. When Tate's message came through on the secondary phone, the one registered to a name that was not Isabella Romano, she read it twice. Then she sat up. The message was brief because Tate was a professional, and professionals didn't elaborate when brevity served. It said, "Summit location compromised. Source internal, not Marchetti side. Recommend you read the attached before making any moves." The attached was a photograph of a document. The document was a floor plan of the Alderton Hotel, the venue the Romano family had selected for the Peace Summit. Selected privately, communicated only through secure channels within the organization's inner circle. The floor plan had annotations on it, handwritten in blue ink, precise and deliberate. Entry points. Guard rotation schedules. The private dining room where the summit's most sensitive conversations were meant to take place. The location of the emergency exits, and this was the piece that sat in Isabella's chest like something with weight, the notations beside 2 specific exits that read, in handwriting she did not recognize, "Clear at 2200, hold until signal." She stared at that for a long time. Someone inside the Romano organization had given Bianca Hart the summit's operational details, not just the location. Anyone with sufficient motivation and the right contacts could have found the location. The guard rotations, the internal security protocol, the kind of information that only existed in one place, the planning documents that Marco had been preparing with Vincent's 2 most senior captains for the last 3 weeks. She got out of bed carefully, moved to the window, looked out at a street that was still mostly dark, and thought about who had access to those documents. She thought about Marco. She put the thought down immediately, not because she was certain, but because she needed to be certain before she did anything with it, and she wasn't certain yet, and acting on the wrong certainty at this stage would destroy everything she'd built. She called Tate. He answered on the first ring. "You saw it. Where did this come from?" "Bianca Hart's vehicle. She left it on the passenger seat in a parking structure on the east side. I had eyes on her from 2 blocks, saw her pull it out and study it, put it back. I got close enough to photograph it through the window before she drove off. She left it visible." "She did." Isabella processed that. "She's not careless." "No," Tate said. "She is not." "Which means she left it visible intentionally, or she wanted someone to see it." "Or she wanted someone to see that she had it," Tate said, "which is a different thing." It was a different thing. It meant the document wasn't intelligence she was concealing. It was a credential she was displaying, a proof of access, something she was showing to someone. "Was she meeting anyone in that structure?" Isabella said. "She went in, sat in the car for 12 minutes, came out. Alone the whole time." "Who owns the structure?" A pause while he checked something. managed by a parking company, but the building itself is held by a real estate LLC. I'm looking at the registration now. Another pause. The LLC traces to a holding entity out of... What? The same Delaware chain as the shell company your accountant found. Different terminal entity, but same chain. Isabella stood very still. She was at her own building, she said. Looks that way. She wasn't showing the document to anyone. She was depositing it, some kind of dead drop that doesn't require a second person. That's my read. Isabella thought about the annotations. Clear at 2200, hold until signal. That wasn't intelligence going to the Marchetti family. That was operational instruction going to someone who was going to be physically present at the summit, someone on the inside. She said, I need you to pull the personnel list for the summit security detail. Everyone Vincent's people have approved for the inner perimeter. That's going to take me a couple of days to get cleanly. You have 1 day, she said. I need it before the summit planning meeting on Friday. She hung up. She stood at the window and watched the street get light in increments and thought about what she was looking at. Bianca Hart had a mole. Someone in the Romano security apparatus who was going to be present at the summit, who had access to the guard rotations, who was going to hold an exit clear at 10 p.m. and wait for a signal. The question that was keeping her very carefully still, that she was not going to answer until she had more, was whether the mole had been placed by Bianca or whether the mole had placed Bianca, because those were two very different scenarios with two very different women at their center. The Friday planning meeting happened in the basement conference room of the dry cleaning operation on Faraday Street, which was where Vincent held anything that needed to stay off every form of electronic record. Stone walls, no windows, a signal jammer running in the corner that looked like a router. 12 men around the table, Marco at Vincent's right. The two senior captains, Ricci and Di Matteo, across from each other with their respective lieutenants. The head of external security, a man named Paulson, who had come over from a government background that nobody asked too closely about. Isabella was not at this meeting. She had never been at these meetings. But Tate was. Not in the room, in the building, in the legitimate dry cleaning operation above, running a maintenance errand that Reyes had arranged through a contact who did occasional work for the Romano properties. It was imperfect coverage. She knew that. She got fragments, not full scenes. What she got was enough. Paulson presented the security schematic for the summit. Standard coverage, nothing remarkable. When he reached the section on the inner perimeter for the private dining room, he paused and mentioned that he'd added 2 additional personnel to the 10 p.m. rotation to handle a gap he'd identified in coverage of the north exit. Marco asked who. Paulson named 2 men, Ferris and Calvo, and described them as recent additions to the external security roster who had been vetted through the standard process. Marco made a note and moved on. Isabella received Tate's summary of the fragment at 2 in the afternoon, read it in her car in the parking lot of the Foundation's office, and felt something drop in her stomach. Ferris and Calvo, added to the 10 p.m. rotation. At the north exit. Clear at 2200, hold until signal. She called Donna. I need the background check on 2 names right now, whatever Renata can pull in the next 6 hours. Give me the names. Ferris, Calvo, they'll have some kind of paper trail that connects them to a legitimate security firm. That's the cover. I need whatever's underneath it. What am I looking for underneath it? Marchetti, Isabella said. A silence. Isabella, Donna said quietly. This is moving faster than I thought it was. I know, Isabella said. Run the names. She sat in the car after she hung up and put both hands on the wheel and breathed. 11 days. She had 11 days before the summit. She had Donna working the financial documentation for the federal contact. She had Tate covering Bianca's movements. She had the beginnings of a picture that was coalescing into something she could present. What she did not have was Vincent. She had been working around Vincent for weeks, moving pieces on a board that he didn't know existed, and she had told herself that it was necessary, that he would protect Bianca if he knew, that he would mismanage the information, that his obsession had blinded him in ways he couldn't recognize. All of that was true. She still believed all of it, But there was a piece of this she had been not thinking, and it arrived now in the parking lot with a clarity she couldn't avoid. The summit floor plan had come from inside the planning process. She had a list of who had access to those documents, and it was a short list, and Marco's name was on it. She needed to know if Marco knew. Whether Marco knew was the axis everything else turned on. She went home. She found Marco's car in the driveway, which meant he was inside. Unusual at 3 in the afternoon, unusual enough that she felt it in her chest as she parked and moved toward the door. Marco came to the house when there was something that needed Vincent's direct attention, and the phone wasn't adequate. He came to the house when something was wrong. She heard them through the study door before she opened it, and she stopped in the hallway. Vincent's voice, low and controlled. How long? Marco. Long enough that I'm telling you now. Vincent. You're sure? Marco. I'm sure of the account connections. I'm not sure of the intent. Those aren't the same thing. She pushed open the door. Both men turned. Vincent's face was doing something complicated. The jaw set, the eyes too still, the particular expression of a man processing a shock through the filter of a man who was not supposed to show shock. Marco looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not guilt. Something more like acknowledgement, like he had been waiting for her to walk through a door, and here she was. Sit down, Isabella, Vincent said. Tell me what you're talking about, she said. She didn't sit. A silence between the two men. Marco glanced at Vincent. Vincent's jaw worked. There are accounts, Vincent said, connected to Bianca. Connected to Bianca and the Marchetti family, Isabella said. The quality of the silence changed completely. Vincent stared at her. How long have you known? Long enough, she said, which was Marco's answer, and she watched Marco register that she'd used it. What else do you know? Vincent said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he was genuinely unprepared, quiet in a way that wasn't calm, the way a held breath is not calm. I know about the floor plan, she said. I know about Ferris and Calvo. I know about the north exit and the 10 o'clock instruction. The room was very quiet. Vincent stood up from behind the desk. He was a large man in a small space when he was angry, and the anger was coming off him now in the radiating, controlled way it did when he was working to contain it. You've been running an investigation, he said. I've been doing what you weren't doing, she said. How long? Since the night of the gala. The words landed. She watched them land. She watched him understand in the space of about 4 seconds that his pregnant wife had been running parallel intelligence gathering for weeks while he was sitting at Bianca's hospital bedside and convincing himself that the problem was manageable. Jesus, he said. It came out soft. The summit is in 11 days, she said, and there are 2 men on your inner perimeter security detail who are going to open the north exit at 10 p.m. when someone gives them a signal. I don't know what comes through that exit. I have some guesses that I don't want to be right about. Marco made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Both of them looked at him. He was looking at the floor. His hands were on his knees and his face had the look of a man running a private accounting. When he looked up, he looked at Isabella, not Vincent. The floor plan, he said. You said Bianca had the floor plan. Yes. With annotations. Yes. Guard rotations. Yes? Marco nodded slowly. I need to tell you something. He looked at Vincent then, and his voice was the same flat voice it always was, but the flatness was carrying more weight than usual, the way a flat surface can carry weight until it can't. I've been watching Bianca Hart since before you knew what she was. Vincent went completely still. I had concerns, Marco said, about 18 months ago, about the timing of certain setbacks. I started watching how information moved in and out of situations where she was present. I didn't have enough to bring to you. He paused. I also didn't know how you'd receive it, given the situation. Given that I was sleeping with her, Vincent said. Given that, Marco said. And 3 weeks ago I confirmed that she had passed the Crestfield operation timeline to an outside party. I was still building the full picture. I hadn't determined the recipient. The recipient was the Marchetti family, Isabella said. Marco looked at her steadily. I believe so now, yes. And the floor plan was given to her by someone in this organization, she said. Someone who had access to Paulson's planning documents. The silence stretched. I gave her the location, Marco said. Not the plan, the location only, 2 weeks before the summit was announced internally. I was testing whether she'd move on it. He looked at Vincent. She moved on it within 48 hours. That's when I knew the shape of it. You gave her the location, Vincent said, to test her, without telling me. Because I knew, Marco said, with a patience that had something sharp underneath it, that if I told you, you would tell her, or you would behave differently around her, and I would lose the test. I'm sorry for that. It was not a decision I made easily. The room breathed. Isabella looked at Marco for a long moment. She thought, he's telling the truth. Not all of it. There was more calculation in his 18 months of watching than he was presenting, more decision-making about when and whether to surface what he knew, and some of that calculation had been about protecting his own position in the organization through a period when Vincent's judgment was compromised. But the core of it was true. He had been watching. He had been careful. He was not the source of the floor plan, which meant the floor plan had come from Paulson, or from Ricci, or from Di Matteo, or from one of their lieutenants, which meant the problem was deeper than she'd thought. She pulled out her phone. She opened the message from Tate that had come in an hour ago while she was driving home that she had not yet read because she had been composing herself for whatever she was about to walk into. She read it now. The message was 3 lines. Renata found the Ferris connection. Calvo, too. Both traced through a holding company to a law firm. The law firm's general counsel is Bianca Hart's professional mentor, the attorney who brought her up through the firm 12 years ago. His name is Gerald Whitmore. He has ongoing relationships with 3 crime families, including the Marchettis. He has been federally flagged for 18 months. He is the one she's been working for. She is not the director. She is the instrument. Isabella read it twice. She thought about Donna's words. I think she might be whoever she's working for. I think she might be the one directing the play. Donna had been wrong. There was someone above Bianca, someone who had placed her in the Romano organization deliberately, years ago, as a long investment. Someone who had watched her build Vincent's trust and his obsession and had used both as instruments. Someone who had a relationship with the Marchetti family and 3 others, who had been federally flagged, which meant the federal contact Isabella had been building toward had almost certainly already been building toward him. She lowered the phone. What is it? Marco said. He was watching her face. The problem is bigger than Bianca Hart, she said. She told them, briefly, without the documents. So those were in the fireproof case, and she was not ready to show her hand completely. Not yet. Not when she was still calibrating what Marco's full position was, and whether Vincent was going to do the rational thing or the emotional thing. She told them the shape of it. Gerald Whitmore, the law firm, the holding company chain, the Marchetti connection, the federal interest. When she finished, the room was the quietest it had been. Vincent sat back down. He put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands, and she watched the posture of a man absorbing the specific weight of being the most powerful person in a room and the most foolish at the same time. She had no satisfaction in it. She had expected to. She didn't. He said from behind his hands, She has the summit layout. Yes. She has the guard rotations. Yes. She has 2 men on my inner perimeter. Yes. He lowered his hands. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had been disassembling a thing they'd built and finding the rot in it. I have to cancel the summit, he said. If you cancel the summit, Marco said immediately, you signal that you know. And if Whitmore knows you know, he moves the play somewhere else, somewhere you have less visibility, and you walk into it blind. If I don't cancel it, I walk into a room where someone is going to open the north exit at 10 o'clock. Yes, Isabella said. You do. Both men looked at her. She looked back at them steadily. You go to the summit, she said, but we control what happens at 10 o'clock. We replace Ferris and Calvo before they get to the perimeter. We identify and intercept whatever is coming through the north exit. And we have documentation ready to go to the federal contact the moment the summit is over, so that by the time anyone in the Whitmore organization understands what happened, it's already in federal hands. That's a complicated play, Marco said. Yes, she said. A lot of moving pieces. Yes. If any one piece fails, I know what happens if it fails, she said. Vincent is in a room with no friendly security on the north side, and something he can't predict coming through a door at 10 p.m. She kept her voice level. I know the stakes. I'm telling you the play anyway. The room was quiet. Vincent was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him in years. It wasn't strategic assessment. It wasn't the calculating look she'd cataloged and grown exhausted by. It was something more unguarded than that, something that sat uncomfortably close to the look he had given her a very long time ago, when he had first understood who she was. He said, You've been building this for weeks. Yes, she said, while I was... He stopped. While you were where you were, she said, without inflection. Yes. A long silence. What do you need from me? He said. I need Paulson out of the summit security operation without tipping him that he's burned, she said. I need you to give that task to Marco and trust that Marco will handle it cleanly. I need the inner perimeter rebuilt from people Marco chooses personally, none of whom have had contact with Bianca Hart or the Whitmore firm. And I need you to go into that summit and behave exactly the way you would have behaved if you didn't know any of this. And where will you be? He said. She put her phone back in her pocket. Somewhere you can reach me, she said, and somewhere she can't. She turned and left the study and walked down the hallway to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists, the way she did when she needed to bring her heart rate down, which she had learned worked better than breathing exercises because it was physical rather than mental. And her mind at this stage had too much in it for mental exercises to cut through. 11 days. Somewhere in this city, Gerald Whitmore, a man she had never heard of 8 hours ago, was running a play that had been years in the making, a play that had involved placing a woman inside the Romano organization as an intimate weapon, waiting for that weapon to build trust and access and obsession, and then she still didn't know the endgame clearly enough. Remove Vincent? Take over the Romano territory for the Marchettis? Something more complex, some reorganization of the regional power structure that required the Romano family weakened from within before the final move? She dried her wrists. She thought, I am 4 days from my due date. The thought arrived with a kind of dark absurdity that she was too tired to feel properly. She was 4 days from her due date, and she was standing in her kitchen running cold water on her wrists, while 11 days away, a man who had spent years engineering her husband's destruction was making his final preparations. Her phone buzzed. Donna. The federal contact came back, Donna said, without preamble. He wants to meet, not on the record. He says, Isabella, he says they have been building a case on Whitmore for 16 months and they have a gap in the organizational chain they haven't been able to close. What gap? Isabella said. They can see Whitmore at the top and they can see the Marchetti connection at the bottom. What they can't see is the mechanism in the middle, the instrument. Bianca Hart, Isabella said. Yes, Donna said, they don't have her. They have everything around her and nothing that directly connects. If you can give them the direct connection, the shell company chain, the communication metadata, the floor plan provenance, I can give them that, Isabella said. Then he says they can move, not after the summit. He wants to move at the summit. He wants to use the summit as the moment of capture because it puts every relevant party in the same location. Isabella closed her eyes. When does he need confirmation? She said. Tomorrow morning, Donna said. Isabella, if you say yes to this, the federal operation takes priority over everything your husband's people are planning. You understand that? If the feds are in that room, Vincent doesn't control what happens next. I know, Isabella said. You'd be handing your husband's organization to federal oversight for whatever duration the cooperation agreement requires. That's not a small thing. I know what it is, Isabella said. She opened her eyes and looked at the kitchen she had designed and the house she had managed and the life she had maintained through 5 years of careful, quiet, exhausting work on behalf of a man who had knelt on marble steps and pressed his hands against another woman's wound while she stood forgotten in the cold. She thought, he made his choice that night. She thought, I've been making mine ever since. Tell him yes, she said. The silence on Donna's end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Okay, Donna said quietly. Okay, I'll set the meeting. After she hung up, Isabella stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The baby was still. The house was still. From the study, she could hear the low murmur of Vincent and Marco talking, the sound of 2 men trying to rebuild a plan that had been undermined from inside, working with the materials they had, which were not enough. They didn't know yet that she had just changed the terms of everything. They didn't know yet that the federal meeting tomorrow would determine not just the fate of Bianca Hart and Gerald Whitmore, but the future shape of the Romano organization itself. Who ran it? On what terms? Under whose authority? They didn't know yet that the woman standing in the kitchen 4 days from her due date, with cold water drying on her wrists and a fireproof case of documents in her closet and a secondary phone registered to a name that wasn't hers, had already decided what the Romano family's future looked like. And it looked like her. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs, and the house was quiet behind her, and somewhere outside the city ran its indifferent machinery, and in 11 days the summit would happen, and nothing would be the same after it. And the last thing Isabella Romano thought before she reached the top of the stairs was very simple and very clear. She thought, he doesn't get to choose what survives this. She thought, I do. The federal contact's name was Reardon. He was not what Isabella had expected, which was probably intentional on his part. He was 53, thin in the way that suggested he forgot to eat rather than choosing not to. With the kind of face that had been unremarkable for so long, it had become a professional asset. He wore a gray suit that had been good once and was now just present. He met her in the back of a coffee shop on the west side that she had never been to and would never go to again at 7:45 in the morning, 8 days before the summit. He looked at her across the table, 8 months pregnant, composed, hands flat on the table, and said, You understand that anything you give me today becomes part of a federal proceeding. I understand, she said. And you understand that your husband's organization will be subject to cooperation requirements as part of any agreement we structure. I understand that too. Mrs. Romano. He leaned forward slightly, not with warmth, with precision. I've been building toward Gerald Whitmore for 16 months. I have the architecture, and I'm missing the load-bearing wall. You're telling me you have the wall. I have the wall, she said. I have the shell company chain from the Delaware entity to the Whitmore firm. I have communication metadata connecting Bianca Hart to Silvio Marchetti over a 14-month period. I have evidence of at least one Romano operation, the Crestfield seizure, that was directly compromised by information passed through Hart to an outside party. And I have a floor plan of the Alderton Hotel's summit venue with handwritten annotations in Hart's possession that indicate an operational plan for the summit itself. Reardon looked at her for a long moment. The summit is in 8 days, he said. I know when the summit is. You're giving me this now? I'm giving you this now, she said, because 8 days is enough time to position correctly if you move immediately, and it is not enough time if you wait. What do you want in return? She had thought about this answer for 4 days. She had drafted it and revised it and stripped it down to what was essential and discarded everything that was negotiable. I want Bianca Hart and Gerald Whitmore named as the primary subjects, she said. I want the Romano family's cooperation to be acknowledged in the terms of any agreement, and I want that cooperation attributed to the organization rather than to my husband personally, which protects the legitimate business operations. She paused. And I want the summit to proceed. I don't want it shut down beforehand. I want it to happen, and I want the capture to happen inside it, in front of every family represented, so that there is no version of events afterward that Whitmore or his people can reframe. You want witnesses, Reardon said. I want it done in a room full of people who will spend the next decade telling the story correctly, she said. Yes. Reardon sat back. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank some of it anyway. The north exit, he said. Your information suggests something is coming through that exit at 10 p.m. Yes. I'll want my people on the other side of that exit. I assumed you would, she said. I need you to coordinate with Marco Vitale on the inner perimeter rebuild. He's the only person in the Romano organization outside myself who has the full picture. Marco Vitale has a federal file. Every person connected to this organization has a federal file, she said. Marco Vitale is also the reason I know about Ferris and Calvo, indirectly, and he is the reason the summit security can be rebuilt without tipping Whitmore that the operation is blown. You need him. Another long look. The coffee shop was filling up around them, ordinary morning people with ordinary morning problems. And in the middle of it, Isabella Romano sat with her hands flat on the table and her spine straight and her heart rate at something close to normal because she had learned in 5 years of being married to a man who operated in permanent threat that panic was a luxury and she had never been able to afford luxuries. I'll need the documentation today, Reardon said. You'll have it by noon, she said. She stood to leave and he said, Mrs. Romano. She looked back. How far along are you? He said. 4 days past my due date, she said. I'll sleep when this is finished. She left him with his cold coffee and walked out into the morning. The next 7 days were the longest of her life and also the most operational, which helped. The work kept the physical discomfort manageable, gave her mind somewhere to go that wasn't the persistent pressure in her lower back or the tightening that had started 2 days ago at irregular intervals that she recognized and was ignoring by will alone because she did not have time, and her body was simply going to have to accept that. She rebuilt the inner perimeter with Marco over 3 days of conversations held in fragments, in cars, in the kitchen of the townhouse, while Vincent was in his study, in the hallway of the Foundation's office between meetings. Marco was efficient and unsentimental in the way she needed him to be. He pulled 6 men from the roster whom he trusted with his own life, men who had been with the Romano family since before Vincent's father's generation, and who had relationships with Marco rather than with the current power structure, and therefore had no exposure to Bianca Hart. He removed Ferris and Calvo from the assignment list by the simple mechanism of not including them in the revised summit schedule, which Paulson never saw because Marco told Vincent quietly that Paulson's security role was being restructured for operational reasons, and Vincent, running on the particular focused energy of a man who has been told the shape of his own ambush and is now moving toward it rather than away from it, accepted this without question. Reardon's people came in as catering staff and hotel maintenance and 2 guests of a family from Atlanta who had received their invitation through the Romano family's own channels and were therefore not suspicious. Isabella knew they were there because Reardon told her. She couldn't have identified any of them if she'd tried, which meant no one else could either. Bianca Hart moved normally through the 6 days before the summit. Isabella knew this because Tate was on her constantly, and his reports were models of brevity. A sentence, sometimes 2, dropped into the secondary phone at intervals. Hart was at the hospital for a follow-up on her shoulder. Hart was at her office. Hart was at dinner with a partner from her firm. Hart visited Whitmore at his downtown office on day 4 for 40 minutes. Hart purchased a dress, charcoal gray, at a boutique on the north side. Hart seemed, in all visible respects, like a woman preparing to attend a professional event, which was exactly what she was. The night before the summit, Vincent came to Isabella's room. She was sitting up in bed, which was where she spent most of her time now, because lying down had become actively uncomfortable, with the secondary phone on the nightstand and a glass of water and the tightening in her abdomen happening every 22 minutes with a regularity she was monitoring without acknowledging. She looked up when he came in. He stood in the doorway in a t-shirt and sweatpants, which was not how she usually saw him, and his face had the look it got when he was carrying something that wouldn't process. He was 51 years old, and he looked it tonight in a way he usually didn't. The gala had aged him. The last 3 weeks had aged him more. "Can I sit?" he said. She nodded at the chair. He sat. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor, and she watched him from the bed and waited. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me say it without stopping me." "Say it." "I put you in a position where you had to do all of this alone." He said it to the floor, not to her, which she recognized as the only way he could get it out. The Romano men had not been raised to look at women when they were being accountable. "Everything you've been building for weeks." You had to do that because I was somewhere else. Because I chose to be somewhere else. He stopped. And I know saying that doesn't change anything. I'm not saying it to change anything. I'm saying it because tomorrow is what it is, and I need you to know, that I see it. The room was quiet. Okay, she said. He looked up. That's all you're going to say. What would you like me to say, Vincent? He searched her face for something. She didn't know what he was looking for or whether he found it. After a moment, he said, Are you all right? She considered this question in all its dimensions. I'm in labor, she said. He came out of the chair so fast it scraped back against the floor. What? Sit down, she said with a firmness that stopped him. I've been tracking contractions for about 9 hours. They're 20 minutes apart. We have time. Isabella, we need to go to the hospital after the summit, she said. That is not... Vincent. She looked at him directly. If I go to the hospital tonight, I am not present tomorrow. If I'm not present tomorrow, Reardon's operation proceeds without the one person who has the full picture of what should happen and when. Tate cannot cover what I cover. Marco cannot cover what I cover. And if something goes wrong tomorrow in a way that the full picture would have prevented, your son grows up without a father. She kept her voice even. It cost her something. I have time. The contractions are not close enough. When they're close enough, I will tell you. But right now, I need you to go back to your room and sleep, because you need to be functional tomorrow. He stared at her. You are, he said, the most frightening person I have ever encountered. I know, she said. Go to sleep. He went. She was not certain he slept. She did not sleep either. She tracked the contractions, which moved to 18 minutes, then held. She communicated with Tate, who reported that Hart had checked into the Alderton that evening, which was expected. She was staying at the Summit Hotel, as was standard for attendees with professional relationships to the families involved. She communicated with Reardon at 11 p.m., a single exchange. Confirm positioning complete. His response? Confirmed. 10 p.m. is the window. We'll be ready at the north exit and inside the dining room. Your end? Her response? My end is handled. She put the phone down and sat in the dark and breathed through a contraction that was longer than the previous ones. And when it passed, she made a note of the time and sat very still and thought about what the next 18 hours required of her. The Alderton Hotel was a 40-story building on the city's financial district edge, the kind of place that had hosted heads of state and hosted organized crime gatherings with equal discretion, which was its professional value. The ballroom on the 14th floor had been reserved for the summit's public proceedings, the meet and greet, the formal dinner, the ceremonial component that these events required to maintain the fiction of legitimate business association. The private dining room on the 12th floor, accessible by a separate elevator, was where the actual summit would happen. 8 families around a table, their respective senior representatives, the specific territorial and financial disputes that had been simmering for 18 months to be negotiated or not negotiated. Isabella was not attending the public proceedings. She was not attending the private summit. Her position for the night was a suite on the 10th floor that Reardon's team had set up as a secondary command position. Monitors feeding from hotel cameras, a direct line to Reardon's field team, a line to Marco, who would be positioned at the 14th floor service entrance. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She was 15 hours into labor. The contractions were at 14 minutes. She sat down carefully in the chair in front of the monitor setup and did not think about that. Tate checked in at 3. Hart arrived at the conference registration an hour ago. She's working the room, talking to the Chicago representatives, the Atlanta people, behaving like an attorney at a professional event. Where's Whitmore? Isabella said. Not on site. I've had eyes on his building all day. He hasn't left. He's not coming, she said. It arrived as a certainty. He's going to let the play run from a distance and pick up the pieces afterward. He won't want to be in the building. Consistent with how he's operated the whole run, Tate confirmed. He lets the instrument take the exposure. What about Ferris and Calvo? Still in the city. I've got a man on each of them. Neither has moved toward the Alderton. They'll move after dark, she said. Keep them covered. The moment either of them approaches the building, I need to know. She cut the call and sat for a moment with her eyes closed and breathed through something that was not a contraction but was in the same neighborhood. A deep, spreading pressure that she pushed back against with the specific concentration of a person choosing not to acknowledge their body's signals for a few more hours. She opened her eyes. The monitors showed the hotel lobby, the 14th floor ballroom, the 12th floor corridor. She watched men in expensive suits move through expensive spaces and thought about what each of them would be doing in 6 hours and what they would understand by 10:30 tonight about the woman who had been the quiet domestic component of the Romano family's public face for 5 years. At 5 p.m., Marco called. Inner perimeter is set. All 6 men in position. Paulson is at the public event, not cleared for the 12th floor. He has no knowledge of the revised security structure. Good. Isabella. A pause. How are you feeling? Fine, she said. A silence that communicated that he didn't believe her and had decided not to push it. Reardon's people are in place. I've made contact with the lead agent on site. We're coordinated. Good. The Romano captains are asking about you. Ricci specifically wanted to know if you'd be at the dinner. Tell them I'm managing the operational side tonight, she said. That's not going to satisfy Ricci. Ricci can be unsatisfied, she said. He'll understand tomorrow. Another pause. Vincent is holding together, Marco said. He's in the private room for the preliminary conversations. I'll say this, whatever he is or isn't, he can perform under pressure when it matters. I know, she said, and found that she meant it, and found that it didn't change anything. At 7:40, the formal dinner on the 14th floor was in its second course, and the preliminary conversations in the private dining room had moved into the territory that required the specific atmosphere of confidential negotiation. Quieter, more direct, the performance of the public event stripped back to the actual work underneath it. Vincent was at the head of the table, which was his by right and by the formality that these gatherings maintained, and across from him were the Marchetti family's representatives, not Silvio himself, who was, like Whitmore, apparently content to run this from a distance. Bianca Hart was not in the private room. She was at the formal dinner, which was correct. She attended as legal counsel, and legal counsel did not sit in the inner circle. She was 2 floors above, visible on the ballroom camera, apparently in conversation with a woman from one of the Boston family's delegation. Isabella watched the camera and thought, she's waiting. At 9:15, Ferris moved. Tate's message came through 4 words. Ferris, East Side, moving. Then, 60 seconds later, Calvo confirmed. Different approach. They're going to converge. Isabella straightened in her chair. She called Reardon's direct line. Ferris and Calvo are inbound, she said. East approach and a secondary. They're converging. We see them, Reardon said. His voice had changed register. The coffee shop flatness was gone, replaced by something clipped and operational. My people are in position at the north exit, 2 on the outside, 2 inside the door. The signal to open the door, she said. It comes from inside. Someone in that room is going to give it. I know, he said. We've had eyes on everyone in that room since they sat down. Who is it? She said. A beat. We're not certain yet. We'll know when someone makes a move. She cut the call and pulled up the 12th floor corridor camera and stared at it. At 9:48, Bianca Hart left the formal dinner. Isabella watched her walk off the ballroom camera, and then she was in the corridor, and then she was at the elevator, and the elevator took her to... Isabella leaned forward and checked the floor indicator on the adjacent monitor. 12. Tate, she said into the phone. I see her, he said. He was on the 12th floor. She's in the corridor. She's not supposed to be in that corridor. I know. Don't let her see you. I am literally invisible, Mrs. Romano. The room, Isabella said. She's going to try to get into the room. There's a Romano soldier on the door, Tate said. Young guy. I don't know his name. And then Isabella watched on the corridor camera as Bianca Hart, in her charcoal gray dress, walked up to the soldier at the private dining room door. And she could not hear the exchange, but she watched the soldier's body language shift, the slight straightening, the confusion, the moment of a man trying to process a situation his instructions had not covered. She watched him step slightly to the side, a movement that was not quite allowing her through but not quite blocking her either. The particular paralysis of a person who has been trained to defer to authority and is encountering what presents as authority from an unexpected direction. "Get in there," Isabella said, to herself as much as to anyone. Someone get in there. She was already standing. She didn't remember deciding to stand. She was on her feet with her phone in her hand and her coat on the chair, and the contraction that hit her at that moment was the longest and strongest yet, and she gripped the edge of the monitor table and breathed through it through clenched teeth and did not make a sound, and when it passed, she was already moving toward the door. She called Marco. "Bianca is on the 12th floor. She's at the door." She heard Marco's sharp intake of breath, and then the sound of him moving. "I'm at 14. I need 2 minutes." "You don't have 2 minutes," she said. She was in the corridor. She was at the elevator. The elevator opened immediately as though the night had decided to cooperate on this one small point, and she stepped in and hit 12 and stood very straight with her hand against the wall and breathed. When the doors opened, she came out of the elevator, and the first thing she saw was Tate, his back to her, positioned in the corridor alcove. And the second thing she saw was the private dining room door swinging open and Bianca Hart stepping through it. Isabella moved. She did not run. She could not run. But she moved with the kind of focused speed that is not about physical velocity and is about the compression of the distance between where you are and where you need to be. And she covered the corridor in 10 seconds and came through the private dining room door 4 seconds after Bianca had entered it. The room went silent. 14 men around the table. Vincent at the head, and his face when he saw Isabella in the doorway was, she would remember this, briefly unguarded. Not strategic, just her, here, and what that meant. Bianca was standing at the near end of the table. She had not yet spoken. She had entered and the room had gone still, in the way rooms go still when something has breached the expected frame, and for a moment everyone was simply processing. Then Bianca turned and saw Isabella. Something happened in her face. It was not fear. Isabella gave her that. She was not a woman who showed fear easily. It was closer to recalculation, a rapid, visible assessment of a changed variable. "You shouldn't be here," Bianca said. Quiet. Controlled. "Funny," Isabella said. She stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind her. "I was going to say the same thing to you." The room was watching both of them. Isabella felt it. The attention of 14 men, each calculating, each trying to determine what this was. She did not look at any of them. She looked at Bianca. "Ferris and Calvo are outside the north exit right now," Isabella said. "There are federal agents on both sides of that door waiting for a signal from inside this room. You were going to give that signal, I think." She cocked her head slightly. "What was the plan after the signal? How are you going to explain to everyone in this room what came through that door?" A silence. "She doesn't need to explain it," said a voice from the table. Isabella turned. One of the Marchetti representatives, a man named Luca Ferro, whom she had seen once, 3 years ago, at a different event, was sitting 2 seats down from Vincent's right, and he was looking at her with the calm of someone who had already made their peace with how the night was going to go. He had his hand on the table. The hand was resting next to a phone. He was the signal, not Bianca in the room. Bianca at the door. Distraction, confirmation that the room was accessible. A way to hold the door open at the exact moment that Luca Ferro pressed the button on the phone. Isabella looked at his hand on the phone. She looked at Vincent, and Vincent Romano, who had been sitting at the head of his table in a room full of people who were trying to destroy him, performing normalcy with the discipline of a man who had been told the shape of his ambush and was walking toward it anyway, looked back at her. And he was already moving when Ferro's hand went to the phone, already out of his chair, and Marco came through the service door at the far end of the room at the same moment, and Reardon's agent came through the main door at Isabella's back, and somewhere outside the building the north exit held because Reardon's people were on both sides of it, and Ferris and Calvo were going to find not an open door but a closing trap, and the room erupted. Not with gunfire, with voices, chairs, the structured chaos of men who understand that the frame has shifted and are trying to determine which side of the new frame they're standing on. 2 of the Marchetti representatives were on their feet. 3 of the Romano captains moved toward Vincent instinctively. Reardon's agent, The one who had come in at Isabella's back was already on Pharaoh, hand on his shoulder, the phone sliding across the table, and Bianca Hart was standing very still in the middle of it. Isabella watched her. Bianca's eyes swept the room, measuring, calculating, and then landed on Isabella and stayed there. And for the first time in everything Isabella had ever witnessed of this woman, the calculation ran out. There was nothing underneath it that looked like what Isabella had expected. No rage, no desperation, just a kind of exhausted recognition. The look of someone who has played a very long game and arrived at the moment when the board is showing the move that ends it. "How long?" Bianca said. The room was loud around them, and she said it quietly enough that only Isabella could hear it. "Long enough," Isabella said. Bianca looked at her for one more moment. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, as though her legs had simply decided they were done, and put her hands flat on the table and said nothing else. The room was chaos and controlled force, and men shouting, and Reardon's voice on Isabella's phone saying North exit is secure. Ferris and Calvo are in custody. We need status on the interior, and Marco's hand on Vincent's arm, steering him away from Pharaoh, and 3 agents now in the room managing the Marchetti representatives. Isabella stood in the center of it. She put one hand on the doorframe. The contraction that hit her was not ignorable. She gripped the doorframe and breathed through it and felt the night close around her like a fist and thought, not yet, not yet, just a few more minutes, and then the contraction crested and broke. And she was still standing, and the room was still happening around her, and she thought, it's done. The play was done. Whatever came next would be the legal machinery, the federal process, the cooperation agreements, and the testimony and the long institutional aftermath of a night when everything was inside one room and the board finally showed its last move. She straightened. She looked across the chaos at Vincent, who was looking at her from the far side of the table with the expression he'd been carrying all night. The man who had walked into his own ambush because his wife told him to and had trusted that she'd built the walls to hold. She nodded at him. He nodded back. She took out her phone and called the one number she had not yet called tonight, the one she had been saving for exactly this moment. It rang once. "Donna," she said, "I need you to drive me to the hospital." Donna drove the way she did everything, efficiently, without drama, with the particular focused calm of a woman who had spent 20 years working with numbers that didn't lie and had developed a corresponding intolerance for anything that wasn't straight. She didn't ask how Isabella was feeling. She could see how Isabella was feeling. She drove, and she kept her eyes on the road, and at a red light she reached across and put her hand briefly over Isabella's, which was gripping the door handle with the white-knuckled concentration of someone converting pain into architecture, and then she put her hand back on the wheel and drove. "How far apart?" Donna said. 7 minutes when we left, Isabella said. 5.5 now. "Okay." "Donna." "I know," Donna said. "I'm going." She went through the red light. St. Catherine's Memorial was 12 blocks from the Alderton, which was not an accident. Isabella had chosen it partly for that reason, because she had known for months that the summit and the birth were going to arrive in proximity, and she had planned for contingencies the way she planned for everything, which was thoroughly and without telling anyone the full picture. The labor and delivery floor was on the 6th floor, and they had her room ready because she had called ahead from the elevator at the Alderton, which was the kind of thing she did, and which the nurses on the floor would later describe to each other as the most composed pre-admission call any of them had ever received. She was in the room by 11:43. Vincent arrived at 1:17 in the morning. He came in still in his summit clothes, the dark suit, the tie loosened, a small abrasion on his jaw from something that had happened in the room after Isabella left that he hadn't mentioned yet. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her in the bed, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed, and he put his elbows on his knees, and he sat with her through the next contraction without touching her, because she hadn't offered that and he wasn't going to presume it, and when it passed he said, "Is there anything you need?" "Water," she said. He got up and got water and handed it to her and sat back down. "Pharaoh is in federal custody," he said. "The Marchetti representatives are being processed. Reardon has Ferris and Calvo, and he's comfortable with what he has on the chain back to Whitmore." "Whitmore," she said. Picked up at his building at 11. He was apparently in his office. Reardon said he was sitting at his desk when they came in. Didn't run, didn't fight. Apparently just said, "I'd like my attorney," and that was it. She absorbed this. And Bianca. A silence that had several different things in it. "She's in federal custody," Vincent said. She cooperated with Reardon's people in the room. Didn't resist, didn't say much. He paused. Reardon thinks she'll cooperate with the full investigation. He thinks she'll give Whitmore up for a reduction. She will, Isabella said. She's practical. Is that what you call it? I call it what it is, she said. She's practical the way a tool is practical. Whitmore built her to be useful, and she was useful, and now the tool is going to be practical about survival. That's what she does. Another silence. Isabella, he said. Not tonight, she said. Whatever you're going to say, not tonight. I'm busy. He closed his mouth. He sat with her for the next hour and 20 minutes, and he was, she would acknowledge later, exactly what she needed without knowing how to ask for it, present and quiet and not requiring anything from her. Just a body in a chair, in a room where the hard work of the night was finishing. Matteo Vincent Romano was born at 3:41 in the morning. He arrived in the way that new people arrive, urgently and without apology, announcing himself with a set of lungs that the nurses said were impressive, which Isabella found, in her exhausted and wrung-out state, genuinely funny in a way that made her laugh until it turned into something adjacent to crying, and she let it because there was no one in the room she needed to perform for. Vincent stood at her shoulder and watched his son be cleaned and wrapped and handed to Isabella, and his face did something complicated and private that she saw and chose not to comment on. He reached out and touched the back of one of the baby's hands with one finger. Just that, just the tip of his finger against the tiny curled fist, and pulled it back. She watched him do it. She thought, he is going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve this. She thought, that's between him and his son. She looked down at Matteo, who had stopped crying and was doing the particular focused blinking of a person encountering light for the first time, and she said, quietly, "Hi, I've been waiting for you." The baby blinked at her. The room was quiet. She was very tired. Reardon came to see her on the second day, which she had expected. He sat in the visitor's chair with a cup of hospital coffee he didn't drink and a folder he didn't open, and he looked at the baby in the bassinet with an expression that was professionally neutral, except around the edges, where it wasn't. "Whitmore is cooperating," he said. "Partially. His attorney is structuring a plea arrangement that will take a few weeks to finalize, but the framework is there. The key counts are federal racketeering, criminal conspiracy, and obstruction. There are 11 separate instances of interfered investigation that we can now link directly to him through the chain you provided. And the Marchetti connection," she said. "Silvio Marchetti was indicted this morning," Reardon said. "His attorney is already talking to our office. When someone of Marchetti's professional stature starts making calls at 7 a.m., it tends to suggest he's interested in a conversation. He'll give up the smaller players to protect himself," she said. "That's generally how these conversations go," Reardon confirmed. "Yes. And Bianca. Ms. Hart has been, He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Comprehensive. She's given us detail on 4 years of activity, the Crestfield operation, 2 other Romano compromises we hadn't yet connected, the summit plan in its full form, and the communication chain up to Whitmore." Another pause. She also provided information on operations that had nothing to do with the Romano family, which is of significant interest to several other investigative teams. "She was working more than one side," Isabella said. "It appears she was working every available side," Reardon said. "Whitmore's operation was more extensive than we understood. She was placed in 4 separate organizations over 8 years. The Romano engagement was the longest and the most developed, but she's been a professional instrument for a long time." Isabella thought about Bianca Hart sitting down in that chair in the private dining room, putting her hands flat on the table, the exhausted recognition in her face. She thought about a woman who had spent 8 years being someone else's tool and had apparently done it well enough that no one in 4 criminal organizations had seen it coming. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel about Bianca. She had thought she would feel satisfaction or vindication or the particular cold pleasure of being proven right. She felt something closer to a tired recognition of her own. Two women who had built their survival on being underestimated in rooms full of powerful men. The difference was only in what they'd used that underestimation for. The Romano cooperation terms, she said. Where do those stand? The formal agreement will require your husband's participation as the organization's principal, Reardon said carefully. But the cooperation credit, as you requested, is attributed to the organization as an entity, not to him personally. The legitimate business operations, the foundation, the property holdings, the registered companies, will be subject to a compliance monitoring period of 18 months, after which, if the terms are met, the monitoring concludes. And the criminal operations, a pause. Those are subject to a separate set of conversations that will require a level of engagement from Mr. Romano that goes beyond what we've discussed. I understand that, she said. Those conversations are between you and my husband. Yes, Reardon said. They are. She shifted slightly in the bed, angling to see Matteo in the bassinet. He was sleeping with the comprehensive total commitment of the newly born. He'll cooperate, she said. He understands what this is now and what it costs. You won't have a problem with him. Your confidence in that assessment is noted, Reardon said, in a tone that was as close to wry as he appeared to get. I've read him for 5 years, she said. I'm not wrong. Reardon stood. He picked up the folder and the untouched coffee. He looked at the baby one more time. Mrs. Romano, he said, for what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth a great deal from someone in my position, what you built over the last several weeks, under the circumstances you were operating under, was— He stopped. It was not what I expected when your accountant first made contact. What did you expect, she said. A woman trying to protect her husband, he said. Or a woman trying to burn him down. Those are usually the two options. She looked at him. I was protecting my son, she said. My husband was incidental. Reardon nodded once, picked up his folder, and left. 3 weeks after the summit, after the initial federal filings had been made and the cooperation agreement had been signed, and the media had run 2 days of stories that named Whitmore and the Marchetti indictments, but had almost nothing about the Romano family beyond a reference to a cooperating organization. 3 weeks after all of that, Vincent Romano came to Isabella's home. She had moved out of the townhouse 10 days after Matteo was born. Not dramatically, not with an announcement. She had taken Matteo, and Donna had helped her move into a house in the north part of the city that she had purchased 6 months ago through the foundation's property arm, a quiet transaction that had not required Vincent's signature because it was a foundation asset rather than a personal one. The house was smaller than the townhouse and had a garden that she intended to learn to use and a room on the second floor that got morning light that she'd set up as Matteo's. Vincent had not contested any of this. She had told him, the day before she left, that she was leaving, and he had sat at the kitchen table and looked at her and said nothing for a long time. And then he had said, I know, which was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years and possibly ever. She had said, you can see your son whenever you call first and ask. I am not going to make this difficult. I'm going to make it clear. He had said, okay. She had said, okay. And that was how it had ended, as a marriage. Not with a scene, not with the kind of confrontation that these things were supposed to have. With two people sitting in a kitchen acknowledging a truth that had been present for years and deciding, with the exhaustion of people who had survived something enormous together, that they could be done with it now. When he came to the North House 3 weeks after the summit, she let him in because she had said she would, and because she meant it. She was not going to make this difficult. She was going to make it clear, and those were not in conflict. He stood in the front room and looked at the space she'd made. It was different from anything they'd shared, quieter, smaller, with a kind of deliberate plainness that she'd chosen because she was done with curated impressiveness and wanted to know what she actually liked when no one was watching. There were books on shelves that hadn't been arranged for appearances. There was a blanket on the couch that was soft and slightly worn. There was a child's mobile hanging in the doorway of the kitchen, red and yellow wooden birds turning slowly. He looked at the mobile. He's asleep, she said. You can sit with him when he wakes up. Vincent nodded. He sat on the couch, which was the kind of sitting that had no strategy in it. He sat like a man who was tired all the way through, and she recognized that because she was also tired all the way through, and they were both on the other side of something that had taken more than either of them had calculated. She made coffee. She brought him a cup. She sat in the chair across from the couch, and they drank their coffee, and for a while neither of them spoke. "Reardon's office called me yesterday," he said. "About the second phase of cooperation," she said. "Yeah." He held the cup in both hands. It's going to require more than I thought. More exposure on the operational history." "I know. Some of it will be—" He stopped. "It won't be easy." "No," she said. "It won't." "Isabella." He looked at her, and there was nothing strategic in his face at this moment, just the face of a man who had built a version of his life on a set of assumptions that had all turned out to be wrong, sitting in the house of the woman who had known that first. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "I always told you the truth," she said. "You just didn't always ask." He accepted that. "Did you build all of this? The Reardon connection, the investigation, all of it? Did you build it to protect Matteo or to end me?" She looked at him for a long time. "I built it," she said slowly, "because Bianca Hart was going to get you killed at a summit table if someone didn't, and you were too blind to see it coming, and I was not going to let my son's father be walked into an ambush by a woman who'd been running him as an asset for 4 years. She set her cup down. "That's the answer. It's not a flattering one for either of us, but it's the truth." He nodded. "And ending you," he said. "Ending the marriage," she said, "was separate. That was already done. That was done on a marble staircase outside the Harrington Grand when you made a choice, and I was standing there watching you make it." He looked at the floor. "Yeah," he said. "You don't have to say anything about it," she said. "I'm not asking for an accounting. I'm just answering your question accurately." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I was in love with her," he said. It came out rough, with the specific sound of something that cost him. I know that doesn't excuse anything. I know it makes it worse, in some ways. But I need you to know that I wasn't treating you like you were nothing because I thought you were nothing. I treated you like you were permanent because I knew you were. I was careless with you because I thought I could afford to be." He paused. "I was wrong about a lot of things. That's the one I'd take back if I could take something back." The room was very quiet. Outside, a car went past. The mobile in the kitchen doorway turned its slow red and yellow rotation. "You can't take it back," Isabella said, "but you can be a good father. Those are different things, and only one of them is still available to you." She looked at him steadily. "I hope you choose it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to choose it," he said. "Then we'll be fine," she said. "Not us. We're done, and I think we both know that. But Matteo will be fine, and the three of us will find a way to be what he needs. That's what's available. I'll take it." From the baby monitor on the side table, a small sound. The specific rustling and shift of Matteo waking up. First a small sound, then a pause, then the escalating declaration of a person who had opinions about hunger and was prepared to share them. Isabella started to stand, and Vincent was on his feet first, and she looked at him and he said quietly, "Let me." She settled back. She listened to him move through the house, heard him in the doorway of Matteo's room, heard the quality of the baby's crying shift and then stop. Not because Vincent had done anything skilled, but because infants respond to the warmth of being held by someone who is holding them like they matter. And whatever else Vincent Romano was or wasn't, he held his son like he mattered. She sat in the quiet front room and drank her coffee and looked out at the garden through the window, which still needed work, which she was looking forward to figuring out slowly, and she thought about the last 6 months of her life, and what they had cost, and what they had produced, and whether the math balanced. It didn't balance. It never balanced, with losses like this. The marriage was gone, and the woman she had been inside it was gone, and some things you paid for fully and got nothing back except the knowledge that you paid in full and are still standing. That was its own form of currency. She was learning to respect it. She thought about Bianca Hart in a federal holding facility somewhere in this city, being practical about survival. She thought about Gerald Whitmore sitting at his desk waiting for his attorney, A man who had spent years engineering other people's destruction as a business model and had finally met the countermove he hadn't built for. She thought about Matteo, 4 weeks old, encountering his father for the third time in his life, held in arms that were going to have to work hard and long to justify the wait. She didn't think about the marble steps of the Harrington Grand. She had thought about them enough. She was finished carrying that particular image as the frame for everything that came after. It had served its purpose. It had been the moment of clarity, the door closing, the decision point. And she had used it, and she was done with it. It had made her a widow in a living marriage, and she had taken that and built something from it, and now she was going to build something else. The Romano Foundation's board meeting was in 12 days. She had restructured the foundation's executive committee over the last 3 weeks, quietly and through proper channels, so that the operational authority sat with the executive director's office rather than with the Romano family principal. That was Vincent's position on paper. In practice, it was hers. And everyone on the board understood this, and no one had contested it, because the people who sat on that board had watched Isabella manage the organization's relationships for 5 years and understood that the removal of her was the removal of the thing that made the foundation function. She had also, in consultation with Reardon's office and the Cooperation Agreement's compliance framework, begun restructuring the legitimate business holdings. The property arm, the 3 commercial enterprises that were actually commercial, the financial instruments that could be separated cleanly from the criminal infrastructure and made to stand on their own. It was long, careful work. It would take 2 years to complete. She had started it. She was thinking about the property arm when Vincent came back into the front room carrying Matteo. He was carrying him the way men carry babies when they're not used to it yet, with a slight excess of care, the elbows angled out, the body tilted to present a flat surface, the eyes on the baby's face with the particular concentration of someone trying to do something right that they can't practice beforehand. Matteo was awake and doing the unfocused visual sweep that babies do, taking inventory of a world that kept presenting new information. Vincent sat back on the couch with the baby against his chest. He looked up at Isabella. She looked back. There was a whole history between them in that look. Not the performing of it, not the management of it, just the raw fact of it. They had been young, and they had been in love, and they had lost track of each other in the machinery of the life they'd chosen, and neither of them was innocent of the machinery. They had done damage to each other. They had survived something together. They had a son who was going to grow up between them and who deserved the best version of both of them, which was not the version that had existed in the townhouse, but might be this one, this quieter, more honest, more ruinously expensive version. "He looks like you," Vincent said. "He looks like himself," Isabella said. "He's got your jaw." "He's 4 weeks old. He doesn't have a jaw yet." Vincent looked down at the baby, and something in his face settled, the way a face settles when a person stops performing and just feels the thing they're actually feeling. "Isabella," he said, without looking up. "Yeah. Thank you for the summit." He paused. For doing what you did instead of what you could have done." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "But you're welcome." He nodded. He understood the difference. She thought, watching him, that he might be beginning to understand a lot of things that had been unavailable to him when he was operating on the assumption that he was the most important person in the room. Losing that assumption was not comfortable. It was, however, clarifying. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing what light does in the fall, coming in at an angle and going gold at the edges, and it came through the front window and lay across the floor and lit the room with the specific warmth of something that didn't last long and was worth looking at while it was there. Isabella Romano sat in her chair in her house, with her coffee growing cold in her hand, and watched her ex-husband hold her son. And she thought, this is what survives. Not the empire as it was, not the marriage as it was meant to be, not the versions of themselves they had tried to maintain for 5 years in a townhouse full of careful silences and managed surfaces. This, the specific plain fact of 2 people who had broken something between them, sitting in a quiet room with a child who didn't yet know what any of it meant, doing the only thing that was left to do, which was to try. She reached for her coffee. She drank it. The mobile in the kitchen doorway turned its slow circles, red birds and yellow birds, going around and around in the draft from the heating vent, making no sound at all. 6 months later, the Romano Foundation announced a new program, legal aid and educational support for families of incarcerated women, funded through a 3-year grant from a coalition of city and private sources that Isabella had spent 8 weeks assembling. The announcement was made at a small event at the Foundation's offices, not a gala. No chandeliers, coffee and chairs and people who did the actual work of those programs sitting in the front rows. Isabella stood at the podium in a dark blazer and said what she had to say in 12 minutes, because she had never been interested in the sound of her own voice as performance, only as instrument. She talked about what the program would do and who it would serve and what accountability looked like when it was built into structure rather than assumed from authority. She did not talk about the last year of her life. She did not talk about marble stairs or red dresses or federal cooperation agreements. She talked about what came next. After Marco found her by the coffee table and stood beside her in the way he'd always stood beside her, not quite adjacent, not quite separate, the physical grammar of a man who had chosen his position and was at peace with it. "Reardon's office closed the Whitmore case yesterday," he said. "I know," she said. "He called me." 23 counts, Marco said. "Gerald Whitmore is going to die in a federal facility, probably. That's what 23 counts means at his age." She picked up a coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "And Bianca," she said, 7 years. Cooperation reduction from the original 14. She'll be out in 5 probably, with good behavior." A pause. "She's not a young woman anymore. She'll be almost 40 when she gets out. No law license, no Whitmore, no next play." Isabella thought about that for a moment. She didn't feel what she might have expected to feel. What she felt was something more like the absence of feeling, the clean space that opens up when something you've been carrying has finally been set down. "How's Vincent?" she said. "Better," Marco said, in the specific way that meant better than he was, which was still not uncomplicated. "He's working with Reardon's office, doing what he said he would. It's hard for him. He's a man who built his life on a certain understanding of himself, and that understanding is having to change." Marco paused. "He's changing it. That's what I'll say." "That's enough," Isabella said. "For now." She looked out at the room. The program directors and the legal aid attorneys and the city representatives and the foundation staff, all the ordinary people doing the ordinary, unglamorous work of making something slightly better than it had been. And she felt the simple satisfaction of a thing she had built that was going to outlast the circumstances of its building. Matteo was with his grandmother, Vincent's mother, who had come to see the baby 3 times a week since his birth, and who had said once to Isabella over tea in the North House kitchen, without preamble, "I always knew you were the right one. I never told him. I should have told him." And Isabella had poured more tea and said, "It wouldn't have changed anything. He had to learn it himself." And Vincent's mother had looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had spent 60 years watching men learn things the hard way, and said, "Yes, they always do." Tonight she would pick up Matteo and take him home and put him in the room with the morning light and sit on the edge of the crib in the dark the way she did some nights. Not because he needed her there, but because she needed to be there, needed the specific weight of it, the realness of this small person who had come through everything she'd built and survived and would never know the cost of what he'd been born into. She would tell him someday, when he was old enough. Not everything, but enough. The shape of it. The thing his mother had chosen and what she had chosen it for. And maybe he would understand and maybe he wouldn't, but she was going to give him the chance to understand, which was more than most people got, which was, she had come to believe, the only form of legacy that was worth building. She set her empty cup down. She put on her coat. She went to get her son. The room went on behind her. Voices and coffee and the ordinary forward motion of the work, and outside the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent and relentless, burning through the evening on its own terms. And Isabella Romano walked through it without hurrying, her coat buttoned against the October cold, her chin up, her eyes forward, not toward what had been, not away from what had cost her, just forward, just this.